Great, so our scene is set up and ready to get started with some coding. So what we're going to do is start our first script. So to do that, what we need to do is click in our project panel down here. We want to go back to resources and then click into scripts and create it. Once we're in this folder, we're going to right click, hit create, and then find the C# option and select that. And with clicking anywhere, this is important. Don't click anything. We want to keep this text here blue. So if you click, that's going to make it not blue, and that's not good. So with this text still blue, we're going to type player with a capital P and controller with a capital C. Keep in mind that any capitalization or spacing or punctuation or really anything that I type should be matched exactly the way I do it. So those of you who are copying me and working along with me, make sure that you are getting the same capitals and spelling the exact same way. And if you have to slow down a little bit to make sure you can get a good look at the script and make sure everything is copied perfectly, that's totally fine. Take as much time as you need, but just make sure that we're copying everything exactly. Otherwise, that check setup button that we use isn't going to like giving us credit if we're missing something as silly as a capital letter or a misspelled word. So really take your time with that and make sure you're copying stuff as exactly as possible. So once we've got our player controller script, let's go ahead and select the player game object. We can collapse some of these components here, the capsule mesh renderer and rigid capsule collider. We're going to leave the rigid body open just in case. But once we've got that done, we can grab our player controller script, just click and hold, and drag that over here into the empty space underneath where it says add component. And now you'll see that player controller script component appear. What we need to do also is make sure that any scripts we make are in this created scripts folder, because otherwise we're also not going to be able to get credit from check setup. So great, now that we've got this set up, let's go ahead and double click on either the file here or on our player. We can double click where it says player controller here. That's the way I prefer to do it. So I'm going to double click on that guy, and that's going to open up Visual Studio for us. So we'll get it open, we'll full screen, and then I'll zoom in a little bit here. So we are going to be using our void start and void update methods, so we're going to keep them right there. What we want to start by doing, and let me close this little dialog box here. What we're going to start with doing is clicking to the right of this bracket. We don't want to be to the left, we want to be to the right. And we're going to hit enter a few times to add some space. Keep in mind that we need to make sure we are keeping all of the brackets here. The brackets tell our code, or tell Unity really where the code begins and ends, so we want to make sure that these don't get deleted, and if they do and you start having problems, that's a good place to check is make sure you got an open bracket that is a bracket facing to the left and a closed bracket that is a bracket facing to the right after really almost everything. That's going to be one huge one that all your code will be inside for the class, that is for the script. And there's also going to be one every time we create what's called a method. And a method is one of these bits of code that says something like void start or void process inputs or something, but it has these parentheses after it. Again, the brackets for that tell us that whenever we want to use something, like if we want to say, player controller dot start, any code inside of the brackets for that will be executed. So yeah, brackets are very important. We want to make sure we're not missing any of those. They always come in pairs, an open and a close. Same with the parentheses as well. They always come in pairs. But once we add our space up here at the top, let's go ahead and start writing out some variable names. So we're going to say public layer mask lm, and then public transform grapple fire point. Public float jump force, and I'll go over what these variables names mean once we get them all in, but let's start by typing these. Also, something to note here that I just forgot to add. Whenever we're doing a float, I guess I can explain this now. Floats are numbers that can be whole numbers or decimals. There's another type of number called an integer, and you can see if I type public integer jump something, because we're not going to keep this, and I set it equal to 1.4, it's going to give me a red underline, because integer values cannot have a point inside them. So we want to make sure we're using floats in this, because we might want to be able to, make be as precise as we can with these numbers. One thing we also want to do is add an F at the end of this 100. Unity will actually be able to understand it if you don't add the F, but what the F does is make sure that our code knows that we're using 100 as a float and not as an integer. And that's more important later, but for now, it's just keep in mind that whenever we're working with floats, we're probably going to add this F to the end. We're going to add a few more floats here. Public float grapple range. We're going to set that to 15F. Public grapple pull speed. Oops, there's a float missing there. Float grapple pull speed. And set that equal to 0.5F. And public float grapple min dist. Oops, dist, there we go. 0.25F. And those are all of our public variables, and what that means is that these are going to be visible within the inspector. And I just saved my script, and I recommend saving your script after as often as possible. You can do that in a few ways by hitting Control-S or Command-S if you're on a Mac, or you can click this little save icon up here, or you can go to File and Save All. But yeah, Command or Control-S is the quickest way. But what these public variables we just declared are variables that we can actually edit from within the Unity editor. And you'll see if I tab back over to Unity now, you'll see now we have all three of these, or six variables are now visible here. And that's great because sometimes we want to be able to tweak values without having to change our code. So now back with the player controller open, let's add some private variables, meaning variables that we can't actually access from within the Unity editor. So we're going to say capsule collider call rigid body rigid line renderer LR vector3 move dir equals new vector3 0 0 0. And it's important that we add this new keyword because we want to make sure our move direction vector always exists. Since we're going to be just assigning values where these zeros are, if we don't use the new vector3 thing and we just say, like we're going to for current velocity, we just add our semicolon at the end instead of doing this assignment, we won't actually be able to change the values of movedir without creating a new vector3. Also, I didn't mention it earlier, every line of code, these are called methods. Every method name gets these parentheses at the end, but every line of code, that means variable names or code within a method, has a semicolon at the end. Every single one. And if you don't have a semicolon, even if you're missing just one, it's going to make Unity throw like 30 errors at you because it's going to throw your whole script off. So let's make sure that we're adding these semicolons at the end of every line. And we can continue on here. We got another vector3, and vector3s are just they're called data structures, and it's a data structure that holds basically three number values, three float values. So we can use those to store three different numbers simultaneously in one variable rather than having to have three separate variables. We're going to call this third vector3 grapple point. We're then going to add a float rope dist, a bool or boolean, which means a true or false value. We're going to call this can grapple equals true. Oops, equals true. And then a bool grappling equals false. Great, so we've got all of that. That looks good to me. What we then want to do is go inside this start method. So we're going to click inside these two brackets here. We're going to add 3 lines of code. We're going to say rigid equals get component, and then our angled brackets. So you get that by holding shift and hitting the comma key, and comma and the period key. And inside those angled brackets, we're going to say rigid body, and then step outside of the angled brackets and add an open and close parentheses. We need to do this a couple more times, but for different variables. So we're going to say call is equal to get component capsule collider. There we go, open and close parentheses and our semicolon. And LR is equal to get component in children line renderer. Oops, I missed my angled bracket key. There we go. and then open and close parentheses and the semicolon. And this get component is actually a method. That's why we're using the open and close parentheses here. When we call a method, that means when we're telling a method to use its code, that's when we add our semicolon at the end. But when we're defining a method that is writing the code or creating the method and adding the code that the method will run when it's called, we don't have the semicolon. So that's why we've got 3 here. And this method we're calling getComponent is a built-in Unity method that allows us to get access to components that are on our game object. Our game object being, in this case, our player capsule. So if we were to look at our game view again, this player is a game object, and you'll see there's that capsule collider and rigid body component, and that's what we're getting access to by using this get component line. And line renderer is a component that we're going to add later on to our player controller in a future step. But for now, we're going to leave this as is. So go ahead and save your script, again, by Controller Command S or by selecting the save icon here or in File. And then we can go ahead and move on to step 3.